Decision 2012 coverage continues with our first person, Kevin Wade, the Republican in the race for the U.S. Senate. Welcome.
Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for
I
being
much
here.
appreciate it.
We've been asking candidates who come in to do these interviews to sort of start off with their 30-second pitch to the voters. Why should you be Delaware's next senator?
Well, I'm not a professional politician. I'm an American, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a husband, I'm a father, grandfather, and I'm a real deal all-American small businessman. Like so many in the neighborhoods across Delaware, after cutting the grass and growing a business and fixing a leaky roof, raising a family, I looked around one day to see what was happening beyond the short range of my own vision. And what I saw happening in our country sickened me. And I took a look at so many problems that are growing, festering in this country, creating a decline in our quality of life. And I looked at the source of these problems, and all roads led to Washington. I know that Washington is broken. I'm an engineer, I know how to fix things, but Washington is broken. It can't fix itself. And ultimately, Washington can't change till we change the people in Washington.
Where do you fit in with the Republican Party philosophically, especially here in Delaware? It seems like there's a lot of different style of Republicans. What is your philosophy as far as a Republican? You have a lot of Tea Party support downstate in the Republican Party, a little bit more moderate to the middle in the northern part of the state. Where do you fall in that range? Well,
every Republican has his own political views. There is no common thread through it. You have the Liberty movement, the Tea Party movement perhaps, whose primary focus is on two things: read the Constitution and follow it, pass a budget and balance it. It's no more radical than that. We have more centrist Republicans who are primarily looking at the financial cliff, the fiscal cliff that this country is approaching, and their concerns are financial. How do we as a people get through this abyss? And then there are social conservatives whose emphasis in their activity is the quality of life primarily for our children. What type of country are we passing on to our children? So all of these come together to make the Republican Party in Delaware. I'm very pleased to have essentially the unanimous support of people across Delaware in the Republican Party, and frankly quite a few independents and Democrats.
Do you consider yourself more of a conservative Republican, more of a moderate? Where do you
No, I am a conservative. I am a conservative. I'm conservative by the forces that have shaped my life. I grew up poor, on the harsher side of life, in a factory town in Pennsylvania. I know the value of a dollar. Why do I know the value of a dollar? Well, my mom used to sit at a table lamp late into the evening, sewing clothes far nicer than her own for other women, to make $1 for each piece she worked on, to have some extra money to put food on the table. So when someone talks about a dollar, I think of my mom sitting by a table lamp late into the night. She was a single mom. There were 4 of us. The only thing in plentiful supply was a shortfall of everything. I went to work in a steel mill 3 days after high school, and I dodged the hot steel and I earned a man's paycheck. And they weren't at all concerned about my self-esteem. It was, son, if you want to take a man's check, you do the man's work. So I know what work is. I know how dirty and grimy and dangerous it can be, but I also know the pride that comes from bringing home your own pay envelope. I worked my way through college. When I wasn't in the mill, I attended school. A couple years later, I came to Delaware. And I tell my audiences, although I wasn't born here, I got here as quick as I could. Every good thing in my life has happened here in Delaware. And I began to climb the ladder of opportunity that was certainly abundant in those days. I came and I worked in the lowest level, the lowest rung of the lowest rung in DuPont's engineering department. And any day working at DuPont was far better than any shift working in the steel mill. So I've seen many sides of life. I'm not a professional politician, but I think I have an understanding that, well, my audiences, maybe your audience today, can connect with. This country has been a blessing to you and to me, and we have an obligation to pass it on intact. As I say, pass it on shiny, penny new to our children and our grandchildren. This nation cannot be squandered. by the bad hands of those in Washington.
When you announced your candidacy in Old Newcastle at the old courthouse there,
Sure.
you said the number one problem in America, the number one issue was the national deficit. You still feel that way?
Well, no, the issue is jobs, but our lack of jobs is driven by reckless spending and waste in Washington. The issue is jobs, and our problem with jobs is created by an overbearing, out-of-control regulatory system. Are you aware that last year, according to Heritage, over 11,000 pages of new regulations were released? We have 250,000 people on the payroll of the federal government who are dedicated to regulatory affairs, proposing regulations, writing regulations, enforcing regulations. If regulations were an export product, all of our pensions would be secure. We have an energy policy that continues to fail us after all of these years. We send $1 billion a day overseas for foreign oil. The tallest skyscrapers in the world are built in the Middle East. They're built with petrodollars, but they're built there. And still we drain money, $1 billion a day, every day out of this country. There are so many things wrong, all connect back to unemployment. See, all of these things create unemployment and discourage new job growth.
You mentioned earlier the fiscal cliff that we're sort of approaching in the country and in Washington. What can be done to keep us from that cliff? What massive cuts need to be made? Is there room for compromise?
Well, the first step, and this is absolutely necessary, is you have to change Washington. It can't change itself. If it could have changed itself, it would have changed itself. Washington won't change until we change the people there. We have to dramatically cut spending. We have to dramatically increase revenues. We have to close that gap. We have to come up with a plan that pays for the existing $16 trillion in debt. And I actually have one. I'll be talking about it later this week. We have to get Washington focused on the needs of everyday Delawareans and not focused as they have been on their own cynical re-elections. Washington won't change till we change those people.
What hasn't Tom Carper done that you would do or do better?
Well, for example, he's blocked the Keystone XL pipeline. Apparently he's fine with carrier battle groups circling outside the Persian Gulf as we speak to ensure the flow of oil out of the Arabian states. But he's not okay with bringing oil from Canada. There's something wrong with this picture. We have an appetite for oil. It's not going to go away soon. But he blocks the XL pipeline by his vote, and yet we have so many troops in the Middle East so far from home in harm's way. That's one. He supported the stimulus program, which has squandered $850 billion of our, basically the seed corn for our new prosperity has been squandered on projects that simply don't work. He should have made that money available to small business. Small businessmen like myself know how to use money efficiently. He appeared on the floor of General Motors' Boxwood plant a couple of years ago to celebrate Fisker coming in and the $20 million from the state taxpayers and several $100 million in loan guarantees from the federal taxpayer across this nation, and talked about jobs coming back, and the crowd cheered because they wanted to get back to work. But now that plant stands empty, the money's gone, and Tom Carper is silent. We don't need a silent senator. We need someone with common sense to go to Washington to do the hard work to rebuild this country. We the people built this country. It wasn't built by big government. It was built by we the people. This is an historic fact. We have to rebuild it now. It will be rebuilt by we the people, by everyday folks. The best people are not in Washington. The best people live on your street. They're in this studio. They work with you at the shop. They're in the other cash register at the mall. The best people are your friends and neighbors. They're not in Washington. It's time to send common sense to Washington.
There have been some questions raised in the campaign, mostly by the independent candidate in this race, about Senator Carper's health.
I never heard of him.
Alex Pires, he was here last week, appeared on the show and talked about the senator's health. Should that be, is that fair game? Is that an issue that you've raised?
I'm worried about the health of this country. Now, Senator Carper has been prone to some very odd statements, but this is not new. I'm more concerned with his ability to provide leadership for this state and for the nation than I am with any medical report. I'm an engineer, I'm not a medical doctor, and I don't walk down that road. Mr. Pyrus apparently has his own standards that he follows, and those are different than mine. I started my campaign January 9th by saying, Tom Carper loves his country, he loves his family, and he's a man of faith. That's how I started my campaign January 9th. You were there. Mm-hmm. But I also said if Tom Carper had done the job he was paid to do, I would not be standing up. Tom hasn't done the job. I tell audiences, we know Tom well. It's okay to like Tom Carper. It's okay to like Tom Carper, but we need to love our children and our grandchildren more as we set a new course for this country.
And there was because of all this health issue that's been raised, there was a video, I don't know if you've seen it, of the senator doing some push-ups on a table to sort of prove his vitality. Any comment on that?
I'd rather he pushed a budget through the U.S. Senate at some point in the last 3 years. That's one of his jobs. That's a constitutional requirement. The Senate hasn't passed a budget in 3 years. Now, they weren't framing houses and they weren't doing TV interviews, okay? They didn't meet the constitutional obligation. Our country is in a financial abyss, and the federal budget is the national shopping list. Have you ever stood in front of a supermarket? I know you have. I've stood and shaken hands while I'm campaigning. Everyone goes to the supermarket with a shopping list. It's things they must have and things they'd like to have and maybe some luxury items on the bottom. It's a shopping list. The U.S. Senate hasn't passed a shopping list in 3 years. We're in a financial abyss, and they haven't done their job. That's why it's time to send, well, common sense to Washington. Washington won't change, as I've said before, until we change the people in Washington. We've
seen a lot of gridlock, a lot of, has led to that sort of lack of movement on a budget. Some say there needs to be more compromise. There needs to be a bipartisan effort to get things done and accomplish things, to do the job, like you said.
Exactly.
Is there something that you see yourself being able to work with Democrats on to get things done and compromise?
I'm an engineer. I've traveled around this country on projects. In fact, I've traveled around the world on projects. And you don't impress anyone by coming to a job site that's overrun with problems and pointing fingers and giving speeches. Your job is to get to work solving the problems. I'll work with anyone in Washington who has answers that can solve this problem and save our nation. The finger pointing, the arguing, the posturing for TV cameras in Washington, it gets us no place. It's put us in this situation. We need to send new people to Washington. I bring an abundance of common sense. Americans are motivated by results, not ideology. Let's go to Washington, let's get some results. When I go to Washington, all of your listeners come with me. We've got a job to do. Everyone has to be involved.
We have well-known Delaware Republican Charlie Copeland on the show from time to time, sort of doing some political commentary, and he said that it would be very unlikely that President Obama would not win Delaware. I think that's fairly widely accepted. How do you overcome that in a state that is overwhelmingly Democratic? How do you overcome that and get a lot of those Democrats to cross over, because you need their help just by the numbers to get into office?
President Obama represents a very positive symbol for many voters here in Delaware. He's an historic president in certain ways. But people in Delaware know that it's okay to split your vote. It's okay to split your vote. The expression that has been offered up to me by many registered Democrats is they've known Tom for a long time, but it's been too long, and enough is enough. I think there'll be many people who will split that vote. And in this crazy three-way race that we seem to have in Delaware, your next U.S. Senator will receive much less than 50% of the vote.
And Kevin Wade, thank you very much for joining us on First Person this week.
Thank you.